In the mist-veiled hollows of the upper Ohio River Valley, with the year 1834 pressed down like an unyielding hand upon the scattered clearings of Grimshaw's Bend, the Voss family maintained the single ferry that joined the isolated settlements to the wider world beyond the water. No one in the community could recall a time when the crossing had not been theirs to tend. The broad flatboat, the weathered house perched at the bend, the lantern that burned through every night. These were as much a part of the land as the slow brown current itself. Travelers and locals alike sought the Vosses for passage, for shelter, for the simple comfort of a chair by the fire and a bowl of stew whose steam rose like whispered prayers. Yet the true ministry of the family lay far beneath these surface courtesies, in a solemn and wordless covenant with the emptiness that waits at the end of every breath. The philosophy they carried was never spoken aloud to outsiders. It had grown inside them over decades like roots pushing through stone, a quiet conviction that existence itself was an error of duration, a temporary clamor against the vast and perfect silence. To live was to postpone the inevitable return. To guide another across that final threshold was not theft but restoration, an act of reverence performed by those who had looked longest into the dark and learned its patient name. Elias Voss, white-haired and steady as the riverbank itself, had first received this understanding in the hard years after the family's arrival from exhausted Virginia soil. He had watched men and women arrive at his door broken by fever or loss or the endless labor of carving life from wilderness, and he had begun to see that some burdens were not meant to be carried further. The ferry, he came to believe, crossed more than water. It crossed the narrow strait between illusion and truth, and the family had been chosen, by circumstance, by inheritance, by the hollow logic of the universe itself, to operate that strait. Agnes, his wife, moved among the guests with the unhurried grace of someone who already knew the ending of every story. She listened. That was her portion of the right. She listened while the merchant from Cincinnati spoke of his failing accounts, while the young widow described the nights she could no longer bear alone, while the farmer confessed the quiet terror that his children would inherit nothing but debt and dust. In her hands, the herbal infusions were not remedies, but keys, subtle compounds drawn from the woods that slowed the blood and clouded the mind until the body itself grew tired of resistance. No violence, no struggle that might disturb the surface calm of Grimshaw's Bend. Only a gradual loosening, like a boat slipping its moorings at dusk. The chosen would retire to the upper rooms with thanks on their lips, and in the morning the ferry would carry one fewer passenger across the river, the absence explained by a sudden fever, a change of plans, the unpredictable mercy of the frontier. Harlan and Silas, the sons, had been raised within this doctrine the way other children are raised within Scripture. From the age of 8, they learned to read the signs, not in tea leaves or stars, but in the tremor of a voice, the way a shoulder slumped when no one was watching, the precise moment when a man's eyes stopped reflecting the lantern light and began to look inward toward the dark. They handled the physical necessities when the time came, the quiet carrying of a still form down the narrow back stairs, the weighting of shroud with river stones, the release into the current at the deepest part of the bend where the water asked no questions. Clara, the youngest, watched and learned with a seriousness that belied her years. She understood that tenderness and termination were not opposites, but two edges of the same blade. Her task was to sit beside the dying and hold their hands, to let them speak their final illusions so that the family might record, in the small ledger kept behind the hearth bricks, the shapes fear took before it dissolved. The emotional gravity of Grimshaw's Bend was never dramatic. It accumulated like silt on the riverbed, invisible until the channel grew too shallow for safe passage. Neighbors began to notice, without ever naming it, that certain visitors to the ferry house did not continue their journeys. Letters arrived weeks later from distant kin asking after an uncle, a sister, a traveling companion who had simply ceased to write. The replies, when they came at all, spoke of sudden illness or a decision to settle elsewhere. The community absorbed these gaps the way a body absorbs a bruise, painful at first, then tender, then forgotten beneath the press of daily survival. Yet the bruise remained. In the long winter evenings, when the wind moved through the pines like a congregation sighing, men and women found themselves avoiding the fairy path after dark. They told themselves it was the cold, the fog, the treacherous ice along the bank. They did not admit that something in the lantern's steady glow had begun to feel like a gaze that measured rather than welcomed. Inside the Voss house, the atmosphere was one of ritual calm. Each evening, after the last guest had been shown to a room, the family descended to the low cellar where the river's damp breath beaded on the walls. There they spoke in low voices of what they had witnessed that day. The merchant's trembling hands as he counted coins, the widow's dry eyes when she described her empty bed, the way the farmer had stared too long at the water as if already seeking its embrace. These details were not gossip, but scripture. From them the family reaffirmed their central truth. The human connection was a beautiful lie, a story told to postpone the recognition that every soul is already alone. By accelerating the departure of the chosen, they performed a kindness the universe itself refused to grant. They were not murderers. They were the only honest witnesses. The ledger grew thicker each year, its pages filled not with names, but with observations of how the mind unspooled, how resistance gave way to peace, how the final exhalation carried with it the faint perfume of relief. The psychological pressure upon the community was exquisite in its subtlety. No one could point to a single crime. There were only patterns that refused to cohere into accusation. The way the Vosses always seemed to know when a man was about to break. The way their hospitality never failed, yet certain guests never reached the next town. The way the fairy lantern burned brightest on nights when the wind carried a new absence across the water. Children born in Grimshaw's Bend learned early that the river took what it wanted, and that the Voss family merely helped it choose. Mothers warned their daughters not to linger too long at the crossing. Yet those same mothers accepted invitations to sit by the fire when grief grew too heavy to carry alone. The dependence was total. The ferry was the only road out, the only source of news, the only steady hand in a land that constantly threatened to swallow its inhabitants. To question the Vosses was to question the possibility of survival itself. And so the years spiraled inward. Elias grew older, his hands still strong on the oar, but his eyes deeper set, as if he had already begun the crossing he had guided so many others to complete. Agnes's voice remained gentle, yet there was a new stillness in her listening, the stillness of someone who has heard every variation of despair and found them all the same. The sons married women from neighboring hollows, carrying the doctrine with them like a second heartbeat, establishing smaller crossings of their own along distant bends of the river. Clara bore a child and began teaching it. Before the infant could even speak, the quiet art of watching for the moment when a soul grows tired of its own story. The family did not expand out of ambition, but out of necessity. The silence they served was vast, and one fairy could not contain it forever. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rose thick enough to muffle even the river's voice, Elias would sometimes stand alone on the dock and speak to the water. He spoke of the futility that had become his only certainty, that every barn raised, every crop planted, every child born was merely another delay in the inevitable return to nothing. The universe did not care. The universe had never cared. The only meaning available was the meaning the family imposed by choosing when the delay should end. This knowledge did not bring joy or sorrow. It brought a calm, so profound it resembled stone. The children listened when he spoke, and in their listening they felt the same calm settle into their bones. They were not evil. They were the only ones willing to look at the truth without blinking. The dread that settled over Grimshaw's Bend was not the sharp terror of sudden violence, but the slow, crushing pressure of a truth that could never be voiced. It lived in the way conversations faltered when the fairy house came into view. It lived in the dreams that came to those who had accepted too many cups of Agnes's tea, dreams of endless water and a lantern swinging above a face that never turned away. It lived in the realization, half-formed and immediately suppressed, that every act of human kindness in the settlement ultimately flowed toward the Vosses, and that the Vosses alone decided which kindnesses would become farewells. There was no final revelation. No outsider arrived to tear the veil aside. The river kept its secrets, and the family kept theirs. Travelers continued to come, and some continued to leave, while others remained forever in the Ben's cold embrace. The ledger behind the hearth bricks grew heavier. The lantern burned. The ferry moved back and forth across the water, carrying souls who believed they were only crossing a river when in truth they were being guided to the place where all rivers end. And in this endless motion lay the final, unanswerable weight that the abyss does not require exposure to conquer. It requires only that someone tend it with patience and love. The Voss family had become that tending. They would remain so long after the last cabin in Grimshaw's Bend had fallen into the earth, long after the ferry ropes had rotted and the lantern had guttered out. The philosophy they served was older than any settlement and would outlast every one that followed. It needed no justification and offered no escape. It simply was. The mist rose. The water moved. The chosen slipped quietly into the dark, and the rest of us remained behind, grateful for the warmth of the fire and the promise of one more safe crossing tomorrow. In the gray years that followed the slow emptying of Grimshaw's Bend, the ferry continued its patient arc across the Ohio, though fewer eyes watched it now. The houses upstream had begun to lean like old men tired of standing. Roofs softened under moss. Windows darkened behind broken shutters. Families drifted away one by one, not in panic, but in the same quiet resignation that had once drawn them to the Voss's door. They left behind tools rusting in the grass, half-finished fences, names carved into porch posts that no one would read again. The river accepted the silence without comment. It had always been the senior partner in every transaction here. Elias Voss died on a night, so still the water seemed to have forgotten how to move. He did not call out, did not struggle. Agnes found him sitting upright in the chair he had favored for 40 winters, hands folded in his lap, eyes open toward the opposite bank as though waiting for one last passenger who never arrived. There was no mark on him, no sign of distress. The ledger recorded only the hour and the weather. 3:17 a.m., no wind, frost on the ropes. They carried him down the back stairs the same way they had carried so many others, weighted the canvas with stones from the same pile, released him into the deepest channel where the current turns inward on itself. No ceremony, no words. The river closed over him without ripple or sigh, as though he had always belonged to it. Agnes continued alone for a season. She kept the lantern burning, kept the kettle on the hearth, kept the upper rooms aired. Travelers still came. Trappers, circuit preachers, men fleeing debts or memories, and she received them with the same unhurried courtesy. She listened while they spoke of the lives they had left behind, of wives who no longer wrote, of children who had grown into strangers, of the ache that settled behind the ribs when hope finally stopped pretending. Her infusions remained gentle, her voice a low murmur that made the room feel smaller, safer, more final. One by one the guests retired to the narrow beds, thanked her for the warmth, and in the morning the ferry carried one fewer soul across the water. The ledger filled steadily. The pages no longer bore dates. Time had become irrelevant. Only the observations mattered. The way the jaw slackens just before the last breath, the precise instant when terror dissolves into something softer than sleep, the faint tremor that runs through the fingers when the mind realizes it has been abandoned by the body. Harlan and Silas returned only rarely. They had established crossings of their own along the tributary streams that fed the Ohio, small operations that mirrored the original without ever naming it. Their wives bore children who were taught the doctrine before they could walk, taught to watch, to wait, to recognize the moment when gratitude turns to surrender. Clara remained at the Bend. She had taken to sleeping in the chair Elias had used, wrapped in the same wool blanket, staring at the same stretch of river he had stared at. Her son, now 6, sat beside her on the coldest nights. He did not play. He watched. Already he could read the slight tightening of a stranger's mouth, the way eyes drop to the floor when a story is about to end. Clara taught him that compassion is not kindness. It is the willingness to end suffering before it becomes spectacle. She taught him that every human voice is a plea to be released from itself, and that the truest mercy is the one that answers without hesitation. The psychological pressure on the remaining inhabitants of the valley had long since passed from unease into a kind of mute acceptance. They no longer avoided the fairy path after dark. They no longer whispered about the Vosses. They simply lived with the knowledge that some journeys end before the opposite bank is reached, and that the family at the crossing is the final arbiter of when. When a husband failed to return from a trading trip, the wife waited a week, then two, then walked down to the ferry house with a small bundle of clothes and a handful of coins. Agnes would offer tea, listen to the story she had already heard 100 times, and in the morning the woman would leave alone, lighter, quieter, strangely calm. No one asked questions. Questions had become a luxury no one could afford. The ledger behind the hearth bricks had grown too thick to close properly. Its spine cracked open like dry earth. Pages spilled onto the floor when the wind moved through the house. Clara no longer tried to keep them in order. She simply added new entries wherever space allowed, writing in the margins, between lines, on the backs of older pages. The observations had become a single, continuous meditation on the texture of ending. How the pupils dilate when the mind lets go of the fiction of tomorrow. How the breath changes timbre in the final minutes. How the skin cools in a pattern that follows no logic but its own. She wrote not to remember, but to bear witness. The universe, she had come to believe, is not indifferent. It is attentive in the most terrible way. It watches every collapse, every surrender, every quiet vanishing, and it records nothing. The Voss family had become its hand, its pen, its archive. By documenting the precise shape of each departure, they performed the only act of meaning available. They refused to let oblivion go unwitnessed. Years folded into one another. The ferry ropes frayed and were replaced with new hemp that in time frayed again. The house settled deeper into the bank. The foundation stones began to tilt. Travelers grew scarcer. Rail lines were being laid farther north. Bridges spanned rivers that once required ferries. The Ohio itself seemed to slow, as though it too were growing tired of carrying so many secrets to the sea. One winter, Clara's son, now a tall, silent boy of 16, took the oars for the first time alone. He crossed an elderly preacher who had spoken for an hour of paradise and the mercy of God. The man drank the tea, smiled at the warmth of the fire, retired to the upper room. In the morning, the boy rowed back across an empty boat. Clara watched from a porch. She felt no pride, no grief. Only the recognition that the doctrine had survived another generation, that the silence would continue to be tended. Agnes died in the spring of the following year. She simply stopped moving. One evening she sat in Elias's chair, eyes fixed on the river, and by morning she was gone. No pulse, no breath, no estrago. The boy carried her down the stairs, weighted the canvas, released her at the deepest channel. Clara watched from the dock. The water accepted her without ceremony, without reluctance. Afterward, Clara returned to the house, lit the lantern, brewed a fresh pot of the infusion, and waited for the next traveler. There would always be another. The river brought them, the road brought them, the loneliness brought them, and when they came, she listened. The valley emptied further. The last families left without farewells. Cabins collapsed into their own footprints. Fields returned to briar and sedge. Only the ferry house remained, a single light burning against the dark, the flatboat still tied to the pilings, the lantern swaying in whatever wind cared to move it. Clara and her son maintained the crossing for no one in particular. They mended the ropes, swept the porch, kept the kettle on the hearth. Sometimes, on nights when the moon laid a silver path across the water, they sat together on the dock and spoke in low voices of the ledger, of the entries that now covered every page and spilled onto loose sheets tucked beneath floorboards. They spoke of how the universe had never asked to be understood, only to be seen. And they, the last of the Vosses, had agreed to see. No revelation ever came. No sheriff rode down from Marietta. No newspaper correspondent arrived with questions. The world moved on elsewhere, canals, factories, cities rising along the lakes. But at Grimshaw's Bend time held its breath. The ferry moved back and forth across the water, empty most days, carrying only the weight of its own purpose. The lantern burned. The ledger waited. The river flowed on, patient, unhurried, carrying its invisible cargo toward the same conclusion that waits for every shore. And in that endless, unremarkable motion, the final truth settled like silt. There is no abyss to fall into. The abyss is already here, and we're the ones who keep its lantern lit. We are the ones who listen to the last story, who offer the last cup, who row the last passenger across. We do not do these things because we hate life. We do them because we have looked at life without blinking and seen that it is only a long hesitation before the silence returns to claim what was always its own. The lantern sways. The water moves. The house waits. And the crossing continues. The lantern swayed. The water moved. The house waited. And the crossing continued. Clara's son, now called only the ferryman by the few who still remembered names, grew into the role as naturally as moss claims stone. He had never known any other rhythm. Dawn, check the ropes. Midday, mend the oars. Evening, light the lantern. Night, listen. The upper rooms remained ready. The kettle never cold. The ledger never closed. Travelers had become rare, almost mythical. Occasional wanderers who had lost their way on the old trace roads, or men fleeing the draft for wars that no longer concerned the Bend. Each one arrived carrying the same invisible weight, the knowledge that somewhere behind them a life had already begun to unravel. The ferryman did not ask questions. He simply poured the tea, sat in the chair that had belonged to Elias, then Agnes, then Clara, and let the silence do its patient work. Clara herself had begun to fade long before her body followed. She spoke less each season, as though conserving words for the final entry she knew she would never write. On the coldest nights, she would descend to the cellar with the boy, now a man, and together they would open the ledger by the light of a single tallow stub. Page after page, decade after decade, the handwriting changed, yet the message remained identical. The precise geometry of surrender. How the left eyelid droops first. How the pulse in the throat flutters like a trapped moth. How the final exhalation carries a note that is neither relief nor regret, but recognition. They read not for comfort, but for confirmation that the doctrine held true even when no one else was left to witness it. The universe, they've understood, had never needed an audience. It only needed hands willing to close the book. One autumn, the last cabin upstream collapsed with a sigh that carried across the water like a tired confession. The ferryman rowed over at first light, gathered what little remained, rusted nails, a child's doll with its face eaten by mold, and brought the fragments back to the house. He added them to the growing collection in the cellar. Shoes that would never be claimed, letters half-written and never sent, photographs whose faces had begun to blur. These were not trophies. They were evidence that life had tried and failed to matter. Clara watched him arrange the new pieces with the same calm she had once used to hold dying hands. Everything ends where it began, she told him, her voice thin as river mist. The only sin is pretending otherwise. She died the following spring, on a day when the Ohio ran high and brown with distant storms. The ferryman found her in the chair, eyes fixed on the opposite bank, exactly as she had found her mother and her grandfather before her. No straged, no pli. Only the ledger open on her lap to a fresh page, the final entry already written in her spidery hand. She waited until the river was ready. He carried her down the back stairs, weighted the shroud, released her at the deepest channel where the current folds back on itself like a question that is already answered. The water took her without ceremony. He rowed back alone, tied the boat, lit the lantern, and sat in the chair that now belonged only to him. Seasons blurred. The ferry ropes were replaced for the last time. After that, he simply knotted the frayed ends together and trusted the river to hold. The house leaned farther into the bank, its windows clouded with age, its floors groaning like old bones. Travelers still came, fewer each year, but always carrying the same story disguised as another. A man running from the law, a woman who had buried too many children, a boy who had seen something in the war that would not let him sleep. The ferryman listened with the same unhurried patience his family had perfected. The tea was always the same blend, the upper rooms always warm, the ledger always waiting. Each departure was recorded in the same steady hand. The tremor in the voice when they spoke of tomorrow, the exact shade of peace that settled across the face when tomorrow was quietly canceled. He never married, never sought company beyond the occasional soul who stepped onto his dock. The doctrine had become his only kin. On nights when the mist rose thick enough to swallow the lantern's glow, he would stand at the water's edge and speak aloud to the dark. Not prayers, not confessions, but simple statements of fact. There is no opposite bank. There never was. The river answered only with its own slow breathing. He found the sound sufficient. The ledger had long since outgrown the cellar shelf. It now occupied an entire corner of the room, pages stacked and tied with river grass, each bundle heavier than the last. He no longer bothered to number them. Time had dissolved into a single continuous entry, the slow, meticulous catalog of every way a human being can stop pretending. He wrote by candlelight, adding observations even when no traveler had come for months. Notes on the way the wind moved through the empty rooms, on the precise sound a roof beam makes when it finally accepts its own weight, on the way silence itself begins to feel like company after enough years. The universe, he had come to understand, does not end lives. It simply waits for someone willing to acknowledge that the waiting is the only honest thing left. One winter the lantern sputtered and refused to stay lit. He tried new wicks, new oil, new prayers to a God he had never believed in. Nothing worked. For 3 nights the house stood dark on the bank, the river invisible, the world reduced to the sound of water against wood. On the 4th night, he simply sat on the dock in the blackness and waited. No traveler came. No light returned. Yet something inside him recognized the moment. The lantern had not failed. It had completed its purpose. The crossing no longer needed a beacon. The dark itself had become the signal. He never relit it. The house grew quiet in a new way, deeper, more final. The ferryman continued the ritual out of habit rather than necessity. He swept the porch that no one walked, mended ropes no one would grasp, kept the kettle warm for guests who no longer existed. Sometimes he rowed the empty boat across and back, simply to feel the oars in his hands and remember that motion was still possible. The ledger remained open on the table, its last page waiting for the final entry he knew would never be written by any hand but the river's own. Years folded into decades. The Ohio changed course in small, secret ways, eroding the bank until the house stood half in water, half on land, as though the river had decided to claim its caretaker while he still breathed. He did not move. He simply adjusted the chair so that his feet rested in the shallow current that now lapped across the floorboards. The ledger floated for a season, pages turning lazily in the slow eddies, ink bleeding into water until every observation dissolved into one indistinguishable stain. He watched it go without sorrow. The record had never been for others. It had been for the dark, and the dark had always known. On the night he felt the final loosening begin in his own chest, the ferryman did not fight it. He sat in the chair, feet in the river, eyes on the opposite bank that had never truly existed. No fear, no regret, only the calm recognition that the doctrine had been true from the beginning. Every life is merely a long hesitation, and the kindest act is to end it before the hesitation becomes cruelty. He closed his eyes. The water rose around him. The house sighed once and settled deeper into the current. The boat drifted free of its final mooring. The ropes dissolved. The porch slipped beneath the surface without protest. And still the crossing continued. Somewhere downstream, where the river widens and forgets its own name, another lantern may one day flicker to life on another bank. Another family, or perhaps only a single figure, will learn to listen, to pour the tea, to record the precise shape of surrender. The abyss does not require bloodlines or names. It requires only attention. And attention, once given, is never withdrawn. The water moves. The silence listens. The crossing continues. The lantern had long since gone dark, its iron cradle empty, its wick reduced to a blackened memory curled, like a question no one bothered to answer. The house no longer stood half in water and half on land. The Ohio had claimed the distinction entirely. What remained was a skeleton of joists and clapboard half-submerged, tilting downstream as though trying, even in ruin, to follow the current it had once defied. The porch steps had vanished beneath silt and reed. The chair, Elias's chair, Agnes's chair, Clara's chair, the ferryman's chair, floated free one spring flood and was never seen again. The ledger, or what survived of it, had dissolved completely. Ink bled to nothing, pages softened to pulp, words returned to the water from which every story ultimately comes. No one came to the bend anymore. The old trace roads had grown over with blackberry and sumac. Bridges spanned the river miles upstream and downstream. The ferry crossing was no longer marked on any map that still mattered. Occasionally a barge would pass in the distance, its engines a low drone that carried across the water like someone clearing their throat before speaking of something unimportant. The pilots never looked toward the sunken house. Why would they? There was nothing left to see. Yet the crossing continued. Not with oars, not with rope, not with lantern light. It continued in the way silence continues after the last word has been spoken. It continued in the slow erosion of the bank where the house once stood, in the patient accumulation of mud that buried the pilings, in the way the current carved deeper channels around what had once been a dock. The river had learned the doctrine without ever needing to be taught. It carried everything downstream. Logs, leaves, bones that had once belonged to travelers, fragments of canvas shroud, the faint metallic taste of old nails, without hurry, without judgment, without record. It asked no questions and offered no mercy because it understood that mercy is only another name for delay. Somewhere in the wide, flat reaches below Cairo, where the Ohio joins the Mississippi and both forget their separate names, the last traces of the Voss family dispersed. A flake of paint from the porch railing drifted for weeks before sinking. A single brass button from a stranger's coat rolled along the bottom for years until it lodged in the throat of a channel catfish that would never know what it had swallowed. The final entry in the ledger, never written, never needed, dissolved into the same silt that now covers every name, every observation, every careful notation of how a soul lets go. There was no final passenger. There was no last breath to document. The doctrine did not need to be passed on because it had never truly belonged to any one family. It had only borrowed them for a season, used their hands to tend what was always tending itself. The abyss is not a place one falls into. It is the ground that was already there before the first house was built, before the first ferry was launched, before the first cup of tea was poured. Everything else, every cabin, every crossing, every whispered comfort, was decoration. The river flows on. It has no memory of the lantern, no recollection of the chair, no record of the ledger. It carries only motion, only continuation, only the slow certainty that every hesitation ends the same way. And so the crossing is finished, not because it reached the opposite bank, but because the illusion of banks has finally been worn away. There is only water now, only current, only the endless, unhurried return of everything to nothing. No lanterns was. No house waits. No silence listens. There is only the river, doing what it has always done. And that is enough. Subscribe for more videos like this.